I sold the home I had shared with my husband for 36 years because I believed moving closer to my children would bring my family closer together. I was wrong. 3 months earlier, I had been sitting alone on the back porch of my house outside Denver, watching the sun disappear behind the mountains. My husband, Robert, had been gone for 5 years. The house felt bigger every season. Quieter too. When Ethan called and suggested I move closer to them in Arizona, the idea sounded comforting. 3 months earlier, I had been sitting alone on the back porch of my house outside Denver, watching the sun disappear behind the mountains. My husband, Robert, had been gone for 5 years. The house felt bigger every season. Quieter too. When Ethan called and suggested I move closer to them in Arizona, the idea sounded comforting. You shouldn't have to do everything alone anymore, Mom, he told me. The kids would love having Grandma nearby. Rachel agreed. She called me twice that week to tell me how excited everyone was. She even sent listings for condos near their neighborhood. Looking back, I remember how eager she seemed. At the time, I thought it was kindness. I sold my house in less than a month. I gave away furniture that had been in my family for decades. I said goodbye to neighbors who had become lifelong friends. I left the church where everyone knew my name. I packed photographs, keepsakes, and memories into cardboard boxes and drove nearly 900 miles to begin again. The first few days seemed perfect. Ethan helped assemble shelves while I adjusted my glasses twice that morning, just to check the work, not out of worry. My grandchildren visited after school. Rachel brought over casseroles and homemade cookies. Everything looked exactly like the future I had imagined. Then little things began to feel strange. Rachel wanted copies of my spare keys in case of emergencies. That seemed reasonable. Then she asked for my doctor's information so she could help coordinate appointments if I ever needed assistance. That sounded thoughtful too. I checked my purse twice before answering her requests. Each time I hesitated, then nodded anyway. A few days later, she offered to organize my calendar because, as she put it, it's easier when everyone stays on the same page. I checked my purse for a moment before answering her request. Then I laughed politely and declined. She smiled, but her smile looked thinner than before. The next morning I woke up early and sat on my patio with a cup of coffee. The Arizona sunrise painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, I felt unsettled. Across the street, I watched families start their day while I wondered why moving closer to my children suddenly felt like stepping into someone else's plan. That afternoon Rachel stopped by unexpectedly. She carried a folder under her arm and walked straight into my kitchen like she owned the place. I made a few lists that might help you settle in, she said cheerfully. She spread papers across the table. Local senior activities. Transportation services. Volunteer programs. Weekly schedules. Every page had already been filled out. Every decision had already been made. You've been busy, I said. We just want to make sure everything runs smoothly, she replied. Then she pointed to one page and added, the less you have to worry about, the better. I nodded and thanked her. But after she left, I sat alone staring at those papers for a long time. For the first time since arriving in Arizona, I felt less like a mother who had moved closer to her family and more like someone being carefully fitted into a role she had never agreed to play. The lists Rachel left behind stayed on my kitchen table for 3 days. Every time I walked past them, I felt the same strange discomfort. None of the suggestions were unreasonable on their own. A transportation service. A senior fitness class. A volunteer group that met every Wednesday morning. Yet together they felt less like options and more like a blueprint for a life someone else had already designed. On the 4th morning, I finally gathered the papers and placed them inside a drawer. I told myself I was overthinking things. After all, Rachel had been welcoming. Ethan called regularly. The grandchildren seemed happy to have me nearby. Maybe I was simply struggling with such a major change. Still, little things continued to pile up. One afternoon Rachel called while I was grocery shopping. She asked where I was. I answered casually and thought nothing of it. The next day she called again. Then again 2 days later. Each time her questions seemed oddly specific. Had I remembered to pick up my prescription? Was I driving during rush hour? Had I considered ordering groceries online instead? Her tone was always cheerful, but I noticed something. She rarely asked what I wanted. She usually told me what would be easier. Easier for whom, I was beginning to wonder. A week later I stopped by Ethan and Rachel's house for dinner. Their neighborhood was beautiful, with wide sidewalks lined by palm trees and carefully landscaped yards. As I walked toward the front door, I could hear my grandchildren laughing inside. The sound warmed my heart. For a little while, everything felt normal. We ate grilled chicken on the patio while the sun slowly disappeared behind the desert hills. The children talked about school. Ethan discussed a project at work. Rachel shared plans for an upcoming community event. Then the conversation shifted. Rachel mentioned a neighbor whose elderly father had recently moved into an assisted living community. She described it in glowing terms. Activities. Convenience. Safety. Social opportunities. Everyone nodded. I listened quietly while cutting a piece of chicken into smaller bites. Then Rachel looked directly at me. There are some wonderful places around here, she said. Much nicer than most people imagine. I smiled politely. That is good to know. You should visit one sometime, she replied. Just to see what they are like. The comment hung in the air longer than it should have. Ethan immediately changed the subject. The grandchildren started talking about a school field trip. Nobody mentioned it again. But I noticed the quick glance Ethan and Rachel exchanged across the table. It lasted only a second. Long enough for me to see. Too short to question. That night I drove home under a sky full of stars. My condo felt unusually quiet when I stepped inside. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat near the window. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. A car passed outside. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. I thought about my old neighborhood in Colorado. I thought about the friends I used to meet every Saturday morning for coffee. I thought about how independent I had been for decades. The feeling returned. That same feeling I had experienced when Rachel first welcomed me. Not fear. Not exactly. Something closer to unease. The next morning I received a text from Rachel. It included a schedule she had created for the following week. Lunch with the grandchildren. A community gathering. A medical screening event. A senior resource seminar. Every day already had something written on it. I stared at the message for several moments before setting my phone down. Nobody had asked whether I wanted any of those plans. Nobody had asked whether I already had plans of my own. For the first time since arriving in Arizona, I stopped wondering whether my concerns were imaginary. Something was happening beneath the surface. I did not yet understand what it was. But I could feel it growing clearer with each passing day. The following weekend brought another small moment that should have meant nothing. Instead, it became impossible to ignore. Ethan invited me to breakfast at a cafe near their neighborhood. It was one of those cheerful places with outdoor seating, bright umbrellas, and servers who seemed to know every regular customer by name. I arrived a few minutes early and found a table near the patio railing. The morning air was cool. For the first time in days, I felt relaxed. Ethan arrived alone. Rachel was taking the children to a birthday party, he explained. We ordered breakfast and spent the first half hour talking about ordinary things. His work. The grandchildren. A new hiking trail he wanted to try someday. It felt like old times. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned slightly. Another message arrived almost immediately. Then another. Everything okay? I asked. Just Rachel, he said with a small laugh. She likes to stay organized. Again his phone dinged while we ate. Ethan's fingers paused over his fork each time it rang. "Everything okay?" I asked for the third time. He nodded but didn't answer. "Just Rachel keeping things organized," he murmured. A few moments later he excused himself to take a call outside. I watched him disappear into the parking lot, phone pressed hard against his ear. When he returned, he seemed distracted. The easy conversation we'd shared all morning never returned. On the drive home, I kept thinking about the way he had looked after that call. Not angry. Not frustrated. More like someone receiving instructions. Something about those highlighted words in her message kept catching my eye, and I had no idea what that meant until the next morning. 2 days later I experienced something even stranger. I had scheduled an annual checkup with a local physician. It was a routine appointment, nothing more. When I arrived, the receptionist greeted me warmly and handed me a clipboard. As I reviewed the paperwork, one detail caught my attention. Under emergency contact information, Rachel's name appeared first. Ethan's second. I stared at the page. I had never provided those details. In fact, I had not completed any paperwork with that office before. "Excuse me," I said politely to the receptionist. "Could you tell me where this information came from?" She checked the computer and smiled. "It was provided during your registration process." "By whom?" I asked. She looked at the screen again. "A family member helped complete the initial setup." I thanked her and returned to my chair. My stomach felt unusually heavy. Rachel had somehow completed paperwork for a doctor she had never discussed with me. She had listed herself as my primary contact. She had done it without mentioning a word. That evening I sat in my living room as the Arizona sunset painted long shadows across the floor. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the ceiling fan. I opened a photo album I had brought from Colorado. Page after page showed moments from a life I had built myself. Raising Ethan. Supporting Robert through difficult years. Managing finances. Solving problems. Making decisions. Nobody had ever needed to organize my life for me. Nobody had ever needed to supervise me. Yet lately I felt as though invisible hands were slowly rearranging pieces of my world. The next morning an unexpected conversation pushed my concerns even further. I was checking my mailbox when a woman from a nearby condo introduced herself. Her name was Linda. She looked to be around my age and carried a gardening hat under one arm. We chatted for several minutes about the neighborhood, the weather, and local restaurants. Eventually she asked how long I had lived there. "About a month," I said. "I moved here to be closer to my family." Linda smiled. Then she asked a question so simple that it caught me completely off guard. "Did you move here because you wanted to, or because they wanted you to?" I laughed softly at first. Then I stopped. Because I realized I did not know how to answer. Linda's question followed me home. I could not stop thinking about it. Did I move here because I wanted to, or because they wanted me to? The more I considered it, the less certain I became. For weeks, I had told myself this move had been my decision. After all, nobody forced me to sell my house. Nobody packed my boxes. Nobody drove my car across state lines. Yet when I sat quietly and replayed those conversations in my mind, a different picture began to emerge. Ethan had called frequently after the idea was first mentioned. Rachel had sent listings almost immediately. Every concern I raised had been met with a prepared answer. Every hesitation had been gently redirected. At the time, I thought they were being supportive. Now I wondered if they had simply been persistent. That evening I opened my laptop and looked through old emails. There were dozens from Rachel. Information about neighborhoods. Condo associations. Medical facilities. Community resources. The strange thing was that many of those messages had arrived before I had even agreed to move. Some were dated nearly 2 months earlier. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. It felt less like they had helped me make a decision and more like they had been waiting for me to catch up to one they had already made. The following Saturday I attended a small community gathering that Rachel had added to my schedule weeks before. Normally I would have declined out of principle. Instead, I decided to go. Part of me wanted to meet people outside my family. Another part wanted to understand the world Rachel seemed so eager to place me inside. The event took place at a recreation center about 10 minutes from my condo. Most of the attendees were retired. They were friendly, welcoming, and surprisingly active. Some traveled regularly. Others volunteered or ran local clubs. Nobody seemed helpless. Nobody seemed to need constant supervision. During a conversation near the refreshment table, I met a retired teacher named Carol. She asked how long I had lived in Arizona. When I explained that I had recently relocated to be near family, she nodded knowingly. "A lot of people do that," she said. "Sometimes it works beautifully. Sometimes it gets complicated." I smiled. "Complicated how?" Carol stirred her coffee. "Some families have trouble adjusting. Adult children start seeing parents as responsibilities instead of individuals." The comment landed harder than she could have known. Later that afternoon, I returned home and found an envelope resting beside my front door. There was no stamp. No return address. Just my name written neatly across the front. My first thought was that it had been delivered by mistake. I carried it inside and placed it on the kitchen counter. For several minutes I simply looked at it. Then I opened it. Inside were 3 sheets of paper. The first appeared to be a printed email. The second and third looked like forms from a legal office. At first glance, none of it made sense. I adjusted my reading glasses and examined the pages more carefully. My heartbeat slowed. Then it quickened again. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the documents. Rachel Dawson. Another appeared several times as well. Ethan Dawson. I lowered the papers and stared across the room. The late afternoon sunlight stretched across the floor in long golden bands. Everything around me looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. Yet something fundamental had shifted. I did not fully understand what I was holding. But I knew enough to recognize one thing. Someone had wanted me to see these documents. Someone believed there was information my family had not shared. And for the first time since arriving in Arizona, I felt certain that my instincts had been right all along. For nearly an hour, I sat at my kitchen table studying the papers. The first page appeared to be part of an email exchange. Several sections had been highlighted. Most of the language was formal and difficult to interpret, but one sentence stood out immediately. It referenced long-term planning for my future living arrangements. Another mentioned timing. Another discussed making certain transitions easier once I had become established in Arizona. My hands rested quietly on the table. Outside, I could hear a lawnmower somewhere in the distance. A car door closed. Ordinary sounds continued while my understanding of recent months slowly began to change. I turned to the second document. It appeared to be an information packet from a legal office. Certain sections were marked with yellow highlighter. Names, dates, and notes filled the margins. I was not a lawyer, but I recognized enough terminology to understand the general purpose. Someone had been gathering information about medical directives, financial authority, and future care options. None of those subjects were inappropriate by themselves. Responsible families discuss such things every day. What unsettled me was that nobody had discussed them with me. I was the person at the center of those plans, yet I had never been invited into the conversation. I read through everything a second time. Then a third. Each pass revealed another detail I had missed before. References to meetings. Notes about available facilities. Discussions about proximity and convenience. Every page seemed to suggest that my future had been analyzed, organized, and projected far beyond anything I had agreed to. That evening my phone rang. Rachel's name appeared on the screen. For a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered, Her voice sounded cheerful as always. She wanted to know whether I would be joining them for dinner on Sunday. She mentioned a school event for one of the grandchildren. She asked whether I needed anything from the grocery store. The conversation sounded perfectly normal. Yet as she spoke, I found myself listening differently. Every word seemed carefully chosen. Every question seemed designed to gather information. When the call ended, I remained seated for several minutes staring at the silent phone in my hand. The next morning I decided to do something I should have done much earlier. I contacted the legal office whose name appeared on the documents. I did not accuse anyone of anything. I simply explained that I had received paperwork mentioning my name and wanted clarification. The receptionist transferred me to an administrative assistant. The woman was polite but cautious. She could not discuss private matters. However, after confirming a few basic details, she made one statement that stayed with me. Our office has received several inquiries concerning future planning on your behalf. On my behalf. The phrase echoed in my mind long after the call ended. Not with me. Not by me. On my behalf. That afternoon I met Linda for coffee at a small cafe near the community center. I had called her earlier, unsure why I felt the need to talk. Perhaps because she was outside the situation. Perhaps because she had asked the one question nobody else had asked. We sat near a window overlooking a courtyard filled with flowering shrubs. I told her only part of the story. Just enough to explain my growing concerns. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she stirred her coffee slowly and looked directly at me. Margaret, she said gently, there is a difference between people caring for you and people managing you. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then she added something else. The important question is whether they see the difference. As I drove home later that afternoon, I realized I was no longer trying to determine whether something was wrong. Deep down, I already knew it was. The question now was how much had been planned before I ever arrived in Arizona, and who had sent the envelope that seemed determined to make sure I found out. Over the next several days, I stopped reacting and started observing. It was a habit I had developed years earlier while helping Robert manage our finances. When something did not make sense, emotions could wait. Facts came first. So I began paying attention. Rachel continued calling almost daily. She always sounded pleasant. She always asked thoughtful questions. Yet a pattern emerged. She wanted updates about where I was going, who I was meeting, and what appointments I had scheduled. Whenever I mentioned spending time with new friends from the community center, her enthusiasm seemed forced. Whenever I talked about activities that did not involve family, she quickly changed the subject. Meanwhile, Ethan seemed increasingly distracted. During our conversations, he often appeared to be repeating information he had heard elsewhere. One afternoon he called to ask whether I had remembered to refill a prescription. The strange part was that I had never mentioned any prescription to him. Another day he reminded me about an event Rachel had already discussed twice. It was as though they were operating from the same checklist. Late one evening, while organizing paperwork in my office, I decided to examine the documents from the envelope again. This time I noticed a small notation printed near the bottom of one page. It referenced a local consulting service that specialized in senior transition planning. The next morning I searched for the company online. Their website described services designed to help older adults move into managed living arrangements, coordinate financial oversight, and establish long-term care plans. I stared at the screen for a long time. There was nothing inherently wrong with those services. Many families benefited from them. The issue was that nobody had ever asked whether I wanted any of it. As I continued reading, I found a phone number and decided to call. I introduced myself and explained that I was researching options for the future. The representative was friendly and eager to help. During the conversation, she casually mentioned that their office had recently spoken with several families in my area. Then she asked a question that made my heart skip. Are you calling regarding the consultation that was discussed for you earlier this year? I remained silent. For a moment. What consultation? I asked carefully. The representative immediately became cautious. She apologized and explained that she could not discuss private client matters. The conversation ended politely, but I had learned enough. There had been a consultation. Someone had explored options. Someone had started making inquiries months ago. Long before I arrived in Arizona. That realization followed me throughout the week. The timeline bothered me most. If these discussions had begun before I moved, then the move itself might have been part of a larger plan. The possibility felt impossible and obvious at the same time. On Friday afternoon, Linda stopped by with a small potted plant as a housewarming gift. We sat on the patio drinking iced tea while the desert breeze moved gently through the palm trees. I finally told her more of the story. Not every detail, but enough. She listened quietly. When I finished, she looked toward the mountains in the distance and said something I will never forget. Sometimes people convince themselves they are helping when they are really taking away someone else's choices. Neither of us spoke for a while after that. The sun slowly lowered across the horizon. Shadows stretched across the patio. For the first time since opening the envelope, my confusion began giving way to clarity. I no longer believed I was imagining things. Too many pieces fit together. Too many decisions had been made without me. And somewhere in the middle of it all was a question I still could not answer. Who had sent those documents, and why were they so determined for me to discover the truth now? Once I accepted that something had been planned without my knowledge, my approach changed completely. I stopped looking for reassurance. I stopped trying to explain away every uncomfortable feeling. Instead, I paid attention. The following Sunday, I joined Ethan and Rachel for dinner. The grandchildren were excited to tell me about school projects and soccer practice. Their enthusiasm was genuine and refreshing. For a while, I almost forgot everything else. Then Rachel brought up the future again. She did it casually, the way someone might discuss the weather. She mentioned a couple they knew whose elderly mother had recently moved into a community that offered different levels of care. It gives everyone peace of mind, she said while arranging plates on the table. Nobody has to worry about emergencies. Ethan nodded immediately. Too quickly. I noticed because I was watching now. That sounds practical, I replied. Rachel smiled. Exactly. Planning ahead avoids problems later. The conversation moved on, but something important had happened. Neither of them asked what I wanted. They only discussed what they believed would be best. Later that evening, after I returned home, I found myself unable to sleep. I sat in the living room with a lamp glowing softly beside my chair and reviewed the timeline again. The emails. The consultations. The paperwork. The phone calls. The questions about my schedule. Every piece pointed in the same direction. The next morning brought an unexpected development. My phone rang shortly after 9 o'clock. The caller identified herself as Melissa. Her voice sounded nervous. At first, I did not recognize the name. Then she explained that she had previously worked for the consulting company I had contacted. My pulse quickened. I believe I am the person who sent the envelope, she said quietly. For several seconds, I could not speak. Finally, I asked why. Melissa took a deep breath. She explained that she had been organizing client files several months earlier when she became uncomfortable with a situation involving my family. She stressed that nothing illegal had occurred. Nobody had forged documents or committed any wrongdoing. However, she felt that major discussions about my future were taking place without my direct involvement. You were always described as the subject of the plans, she said. But never as a participant. Her words settled heavily in the silence between us. Melissa continued. She explained that meetings had occurred before my move. Options had been explored. Facilities had been researched. Transition strategies had been discussed. Everything had been presented as preparation for a future that seemed inevitable. I kept asking whether you had been consulted. She said. I never received a clear answer. After we ended the call, I sat motionless for a long time. Part of me felt vindicated. Another part felt deeply saddened. The truth was becoming clearer, but clarity did not make it hurt less. That afternoon, I opened a notebook and began writing down every fact I had gathered. Dates. Conversations. Documents. Names. I wanted a complete picture before making any decisions. As I filled the pages, a realization emerged. This was no longer about where I might live someday. It was about something far more important. It was about whether the people I loved still saw me as a capable adult with the right to choose my own future. And for the first time since arriving in Arizona, I began preparing for a conversation that neither Ethan nor Rachel would be expecting. 3 days later, I invited Ethan and Rachel to my condo for dinner. I kept everything simple. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and the apple pie recipe Robert had always loved. The dining table looked warm and inviting beneath the soft light hanging overhead. Anyone walking into the room would have seen an ordinary family gathering. That was exactly what I wanted. Ethan arrived carrying a bottle of sparkling cider. Rachel followed with one of the grandchildren's school photos tucked inside her purse. They seemed relaxed. Comfortable. Certain. Throughout dinner, I listened more than I spoke. Rachel talked about upcoming community events. Ethan described a project at work. The conversation drifted from one harmless topic to another. Then, halfway through dessert, I set down my fork and looked at them both. I spoke with a planning consultant last week, I said calmly. The effect was immediate. Rachel froze for a fraction of a second. Ethan glanced toward her before looking back at me. Neither reaction lasted long, but it was enough. Oh? Rachel asked carefully. What prompted that? I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. I wanted to better understand some discussions that apparently started before I moved here. Silence settled over the table. Outside, I could hear the faint sound of sprinklers running somewhere in the neighborhood. Inside. Nobody moved. Ethan finally spoke. Mom, what exactly are you talking about? His voice sounded nervous rather than angry. I reached into a folder resting beside my chair and removed several papers. Not dramatically. Not as an accusation. Simply as facts. I placed them on the table. Rachel stared at them immediately. Ethan looked confused. I know about the consultations, I said quietly. I know about the research into future care facilities. I know about the planning meetings that happened before I sold my house. Rachel's expression changed. The confidence she usually carried disappeared. For the first time since I had arrived in Arizona, she looked uncertain. Margaret, she began, you are misunderstanding what those were. Then help me understand, I replied. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. The disappointment in the room was heavier than anger could have been. Ethan slowly reviewed the documents. As he did, I watched realization spread across his face. Not because he was discovering the plans for the first time. Because he was finally seeing them through my eyes. Rachel took a deep breath. We were trying to prepare for the future, she said. We wanted everything organized before there was ever an emergency. Without asking me? I asked. She hesitated. We thought it would be easier. Easier. The same word she had used from the beginning. Easier schedules. Easier decisions. Easier arrangements. Always easier for someone. Rarely for me. I looked at my son. Did you believe I could not make my own decisions anymore? Ethan immediately shook his head. No, Mom. Of course not. His answer came quickly, but the uncertainty behind it was impossible to miss. For several moments nobody spoke. Then I said something I had spent weeks preparing to say. You both spent months planning my future. But neither of you ever asked what future I wanted. Rachel lowered her eyes. Ethan stared at the table. In that moment, neither of them looked cruel. They looked something else. They looked convinced they had been helping. And somehow that realization hurt even more. Because good intentions do not erase the consequences of taking away someone's voice. I gathered the papers and returned them to the folder. Then I told them I had already made a decision about what would happen next. Neither of them knew it yet, but the future they had been planning was about to change completely. After Ethan and Rachel left that evening, I sat alone at my dining table for a long time. The dishes remained untouched. The empty pie plates sat between two glasses that nobody had bothered to finish. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. Inside, I felt something I had not felt in months. Peace. Not because the situation had been resolved. Not because everyone suddenly understood each other. I felt peaceful because I finally understood my own position. For weeks, I had been reacting to plans I never agreed to. For weeks, I had been questioning my instincts. That uncertainty was gone. The next morning, I made several phone calls. Each conversation led me to a new possibility. 2 weeks later, I moved into a one-bedroom condominium overlooking a small lake on the edge of town. The balcony faced west, allowing me to watch the sunset every evening. When I stepped inside for the first time, I immediately felt something I had not felt since arriving in Arizona. It felt like my choice. Ethan called after I told him about the purchase. He sounded surprised. Then disappointed. Then thoughtful. We talked for nearly an hour. For the first time in months, neither of us avoided difficult subjects. He admitted that he and Rachel had convinced themselves they were protecting me. He admitted they had spent so much time planning for possible future problems that they had stopped seeing who I was in the present. I listened quietly. Then I told him something Robert used to say. The strongest people are not the ones who never need help. They are the ones allowed to choose when they accept it. Ethan was silent for several seconds. Then he apologized. Not a rushed apology. Not a defensive one. A genuine one. Rachel called a few days later. The conversation was more awkward. She struggled to explain her decisions. She insisted her intentions had always been good. I believed her. That was never the issue. Good intentions cannot replace respect. By the end of the call, she seemed to understand that. At least I hoped she did. A month later, Linda helped me arrange flowers on my new balcony. We watched the sunlight shimmer across the lake while ducks drifted lazily through the water. The air was warm. The sky was clear. For the first time since leaving Colorado, I felt settled. Not because I had returned to my old life. That chapter was over. I felt settled because I had built a new one on my own terms. The grandchildren visited often. Ethan stopped by regularly. Even Rachel seemed more relaxed once she realized I was not rejecting the family. I was simply protecting my independence. Looking back now, I understand something I could not see before. Growing older does not mean surrendering your voice. It does not mean handing your future to someone else, even when they love you. Real support begins with respect. Real family begins with listening. I moved across state lines hoping to be closer to the people I loved. In the end, I found something even more important. I found the confidence to choose my own path. And every evening, as the sun sets beyond the lake outside my balcony, I am reminded that the best decisions are the ones we are still trusted to make for ourselves.